With black men identified by their marked draft cards, they were drafted at a much higher rate than their white counterparts, particularly in the South. While only 10% of the population of the United States was comprised of black people, a much higher percentage of the men drafted for World War I were black. And in the South, at least 44% of white men were exempted from the draft for physical reason. Only 3% of black men were exempted for the same reasons. Black men who had families and were the sole support for children were drafted even before white men who were single. Most of the black men who both volunteered and were drafted were assigned to labor divisions of the Army. The Marines did not allow black men to join their branch of the military, and both the Navy and the Coast Guard had limits to what positions black men could fill. Even in the Army, most black men were assigned to labor positions such as the stevedores, who loaded and unloaded cargo. Black military labor troops also transported white soldiers from port to base, moved cargo from place to place, dug trenches for the white soldiers, and buried the dead. They often worked for 24-hour stretches, slept in tents in freezing weather while white soldiers slept in heated barracks, and were forced to eat outside, even during the winter. Many of them were not provided with new uniforms, but given uniforms from the Civil War, more than 50 years earlier. Changes of clothing were not forthcoming, so some of the black men had to wear the same uniform for weeks or even months at a stretch. Of the 400,000 black soldiers who served in World War I, only about 50,000 actually saw action. Even the 4 units of soldiers, which had already existed prior to the draft, were not used in the European theater, but assigned to territory already controlled by the United States. Eventually, such an outcry developed that the government decided to form black military units, the most famous of which were the 92nd and 93rd Combat Divisions. It was decided that the men in these units would better follow the orders of black officers. Officer training schools were opened in Des Moines, Iowa, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Hawaii, and Panama. 1,353 black men graduated from these locations with the rank of captain or first or second lieutenant. These men also faced discrimination in the military. White soldiers refused to salute these black officers, and they were refused entrance to any officers' clubs and quarters as well. When the 92nd Combat Unit was planned, the soldiers were trained in separate locations because the administration feared the black soldiers might incite an uprising if trained together. Unfortunately, when these black soldiers finally came together as a unit, they had developed no camaraderie and were not able to work well together. Also, the officer who oversaw the American Second Army was determined to undermine the black troops and reported failures among them even when they achieved positive success. The white chief of staff assigned to Brigadier General Charles Ballou was also part of the commander's plot and helped to pass on false information about the troops. The 92nd began its combat in Europe with some successful battles. Then they were assigned to fill in a gap along the front between the French and another American division. Due to their lack of training with the French troops and a shortage of equipment, they were unable to do what they had been assigned. This failure was used for decades as an example of why black men should not be allowed in the military. The 92nd was then moved to what was described as a quieter part of the battle-torn front. Their assignment here was to use frequent patrols to distract and agitate the enemy. During a month of active combat, more than 400 members of the 92nd were unalived. While American officers continued to express displeasure in the unit, the French clearly felt differently. Numerous members of this troop were honored with commendations for their distinguished actions during that time period by the French. Next, the 92nd was ordered to one final battle in Champigny, France, to ensure that the retreating German army was completely defeated. During this one-day battle, more than 500 members of the 92nd were unalived. The 93rd had a better experience during the war. While not completely filled to capacity, the 4 regiments in the 93rd were assigned by General John Pershing, who was the commander of the American army in France, to join the French army. The soldiers in the 93rd found themselves treated as equals by the French soldiers, and were also trained and fully equipped by them. The 369th, a division of the 93rd Battalion, spent months on the front fighting against the Germans. They were given the nickname the Harlem Hellfighters for their strength and tenacity. When the 369th was moved to Minicourt, France, they drove the Germans out of their own trenches. At one point, a lone member of the 369th, Henry Johnson, stood off a German raid entirely on his own with only a pistol and a knife. Protecting a wounded comrade and ending up wounded himself, Johnson killed 4 of the Germans and wounded many others before reinforcements arrived to rescue his wounded friend. They were even able to retrieve a cache of hidden German weapons. Johnson was promoted to sergeant, and both he and his fellow soldiers were awarded the French Croix de Guerre, the French War Cross awarded for acts of bravery. Numerous other divisions of the 93rd proved themselves as well, fighting alongside the French during the rest of the war. More than 200 of their members were honored with the French Croix de Guerre, as well as numerous Distinguished Service Cross recipients. Several officers received the French Legion of Honor as well. Altogether, more than 5,000 black soldiers lost their lives in the service of the United States in World War I. The survivors returned home, hopeful of a warm reception for their service, but they were disappointed. It was feared that they would use their military training to demand equality, and just wearing the uniform in which they had served on the streets of any American city could make a black man a target for violence. Even the leaders who had spoken so eloquently of their service overseas did not personally support the black troops. General Pershing had said, "I cannot commend too highly the spirit shown among the colored combat troops who exhibit fine capacity for quick training and eagerness for the most dangerous work." This was his statement in a published work regarding the black soldiers who had served. However, in a secret communication he sent to the French regarding the Americans' feeling toward the black soldiers, he said, "We must not eat with them. We must not shake hands with them, seek to talk to them, or meet with them outside the requirements of military service. We must not commend too highly these troops, especially in front of white Americans."